Hi, folks. We're going to be speaking about what's known as the configuration school of strategy, what I think is perhaps the most comprehensive way of thinking of an organization and how it articulates its strategy in competition. And it really stems from the work of Danny Miller, who spoke in terms of archetypes or ways that organizations can synthesize an approach to competition. And the work of Miles and Snow, who spoke in terms of configuration of topologies, types of configurations of strategy, structure, and process. And that's really the approach I'd like to take with this conversation, following along with Miles and Snow. And the idea is that organizations, as they think about how they're going to present their value proposition to a market, deal in relatively common systems in the sense that they all take inputs and convert them somehow into outputs that they hope customers will value and therefore pay for. And of course, in this movement from inputs to conversion into the distribution channel, we have to contend with logistics. And if we look at this system, kind of as described here in this slide, it really represents the supply chain that firms must manage. A more contemporary view, I suppose, of that systems presentation. But the interesting part of this is that all firms who are producing relatively similar outputs, or what we might call close substitutes, can be defined as competing in a given industry. Those industries, those groupings of firms that produce relatively common substitutes, are all competing, though, in roughly the same macro environment. That environment that constrains decisions that they may be able to make or offers opportunities for them to take advantage of. And what that means, though, is that all firms basically are deriving their inputs from the environment. They can't get inputs that don't exist, and so they are constrained in terms of the inputs they can use by that environment. By the very same token, the methods of conversion reflect that which is available with that environment. And of course, the products they're selling are those that are valued and demanded by that environment. And so the approach that an organization might take, or its concept of how it's going to compete, is necessarily limited or constrained or informed on some different level by that which is available or provided by the environment. And so that gives us an idea then to begin to think about strategy. Some people believe that strategy is just that. It is thinking about or developing a theory of how an organization can create an advantage relative to its competitors, generate more profits than its competitors. But given the fact that all those competitors face roughly similar environmental constraints and opportunities, it might be we're better off thinking of strategy as an organization's theory about how to adapt to its environment, and in fact adapt to its environment better than its competitors, because it is in that preferential adaptation to the environment where the competitive advantage actually might lie. Now, if that's the case, we recognize, through the work of Chandler in particular, the idea that if we've articulated some type of strategy, there's a structure that the firm adopts that should reflect that strategy. In other words, once we decide what it is we're going to do to try and make some money or to create an advantage, we need to structure in a way that reflects the best possible way to pursue that advantage. But if strategy is about adapting to an environment, then it suggests that since we're adapting a structure to strategy, and strategy must be adapted to an environment, the logical process is that the structure of the organization must therefore reflect the nature of the environment. And we can think, therefore, that an appropriate structure is one that best fits the firm's value creation system, inputs, conversion, outputs, to environmental conditions. And we know the traditional thoughts along this line. We've talked about this before, that if we can describe an environment on a kind of a dyadic approach, it's either stable or it's dynamic. Stable environments might suggest a more stable or structured approach, a vertical approach to structure. Dynamic environments or turbulent environments, those witnessing constant or consistent change, probably speak more favorably to a horizontal or at least a more organic structure that can adapt to the nature of the environment. And so we get this idea then that we can think of strategy as a firm's attempt to adapt to its environment. And since the structure must reflect that strategy, the structure itself must reflect the demands of a given environment. But that's probably not the only thing we have to think about, because the structure itself really doesn't work unless we know actually how we're going to make it work. So the structure itself, while it's necessary, might not be sufficient, because if we have a structure that doesn't work the way we want, if there isn't the necessary linking processes, we're probably not going to see the structure actually deliver what we want from it. So process, this third addition now really becomes the linchpin, that which ties structure to strategy and actually helps the firm articulate the application of its structure to its desired strategy. So, application of structure to environmental conditions comes through process, and indeed the mechanism for making sure that we stay in alignment with those environmental requirements is the province of process as well. In Miles and Snow's work, they talked about and developed the concept of an adaptive cycle, and they articulated three stops, or three problems that each firm must address. The first is the entrepreneurial problem, and essentially is, what is it we're going to do to make some money? Or more appropriately put, where are we going to compete? What's the domain in which we choose to compete? What product, what service are we going to deliver? Porter might have called that industry, the choice of where we're actually going to position ourselves to try and make our profit. The second problem that must be confronted then is, well, if that's what we're going to choose, if that's the domain we choose to compete in, how are we going to set up our value system to survive in that competition? Our system, our process of inputs, conversion, and outputs. So the engineering problem becomes developing some mechanism to operationalize that system or to structure our value creation process, for lack of a better term. And then the third problem becomes almost the idea of, well, how am I going to administer that engineering problem to ensure that it continues to solve the entrepreneurial problem? Miles and Snow talk about this in the context of organizing the firm in a way that can minimize risk or allow the organization to continually maintain its alignment with environments when it changes. So the administrative problem becomes, what's the process by which I can continue to adapt to the environment once I've found an engineering solution that allows me to best articulate my value proposition? What that means for us then is that as that adaptive cycle plays out, we need to have a very good understanding of the environment, obviously, within which we compete. And so we talk about things like pest analyses, analyzing the political, the economic, social, and technological trends in a macro environment that can constrain or inform our choices. If we're thinking in an international management context, we might use Gmewatt's approach, thinking of cultural, administration, geographic, and economic differences, and how they begin to put ripples in our competitive environment when we cross borders. If we think in terms of the entrepreneurial problem, that's this idea of choice of competitive domain. And we might get some help in trying to analyze domains of competition industries from Porter's 5 forces, the analysis of those forces that inform the nature of competition and the potential of profitability in a given industry. That administrative problem, well, that's the idea of, in a given industry or domain, are there certain things we must be able to do? Does the environment demand certain things in our engineering solution? Key success factors is a term we often bump into, and that allows us to begin to think about what is it inside the firm that allows us to best solve those requirements of the environment, those key success factors. And this begins to hint at Barney's resource-based view of the firm, the configuration of those resources that may confer a competitive advantage, or the development of key process excellence that allows us to better respond to the environment than our competitors, or better stabilize our firm in its given environmental place. And so, guys, we can see, therefore, that if we begin to think of the organization as situated in a environment that can constrain and inform and provide opportunity, if we systematically look at how we're going to best approach the domain we choose to compete in and its environmental constraints, if we can answer that engineering problem and indeed set up an administrative function that allows us to continuously maintain alignment with those environmental constraints and opportunities, that might be the opportunity we have to create a competitive advantage relative to competitors in our industry.